Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to Friday morning at the Funhouse with Martin Popoff from Canada. Good morning, my friend. Good to see you
Yes,
again.
morning. How you doing? How you doing?
Good. A little chilly this morning.
Yeah, it's definitely very cold here. I just got back from BC and we had a lot of other problems there. A lot of snow, a lot of rain, a lot of flooding, which is kind of still continuing the old atmospheric river thing. But
Yeah.
got back a lot of canceled flights, canceled rent a car. I was going to drive into the interior and all that stuff, but no, didn't end up doing that. But yeah, you're right. Winter's definitely here. We've had snow a few times in Toronto already.
Yeah, we had a couple of little flurry things and stuff, but it's just been fluctuating back and forth between rainy and then really cold, and like we
Yeah.
got some seriously heavy rain for a little bit last night, and then this morning it's just like it's getting really cold again. But yeah, winter's here. It's like fall just doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
for
so.
sure. Yeah.
Anyway, we are revisiting part two. We're going to move into part two of our what seemed to be a very popular topic last week, the problem child musician. So that musician or singer who just seemed to instigate problems no matter where they went. Could be their personality, could be that they have offside issues going on for whatever reason. These folks are kind of looked at as problem child by current and former band members or management or record labels or just by us, the fans. So we've each picked another five. This will be, again, part two of a two-part series. We're going to move on to something which we'll announce at the end of the episode. Really cool for next week and probably for the next 2 weeks, I would think. So we'll have Martin kick us off with his first choice for today in part two of Problem Child.
Okay, so yeah, my first choice, but before I get there, I am centered better this time. I was actually doing that sort of on purpose before to try to be a little artsy about it, but I know I'll stay centered. But the other thing is I'll really try to stay on the mic too, right? Because this mic is kind of funny. You get too far away and your voice fades right off. So I'll try to stay on mic as well. So apologies for that. I've noticed in the comments a few times. So my first one is Brian Robertson from Thin Lizzy. Now he's always been a bit of a problem. He's a guy from the north. He was a big drinker guy. He was a brawler. Bad reputation. We kind of know what happened there. But before we even get to bad reputation, he has that situation where he's at the Speakeasy in London, and Frankie Miller who's also a very notorious drinker. He's up on stage with Gonzalez, and he insults the guitarist or something, and Brian Robertson comes to the rescue, and he's like defending the guys. Somebody's attacking him with a broken bottle, and Brian puts his hand up and gets his hand all sliced up. This is on the eve of going on tour with Thin Lizzy. Very important tour. I believe this is late 76. So, in essence, they're kind of still touring the semi-hit album Jailbreak, but they're also touring Johnny the Fox. We're about to, and he all of a sudden can't play guitar. And before the night is through, apparently he breaks a guy's leg, breaks a guy's collarbone, and gets knocked out with the bottle, on the head, sort of thing. So definitely a bit of a brawler, and he's definitely been known to be kind of a big drinker in the band. So he's been a problem. Obviously, Phil and Scott have their problems later on, but no, on the eve of this tour, he can't go. Gary Moore is brought in to commandeer again, to help out with guitar parts. Gary Moore, fortunately sticks around, and we get him on the Magnificent Black Rose album. But then Brian Robertson, of course, winds up in Wild Horses with another notorious guy, Jimmy Bain. They do 2 albums, also not a great band. So they're problem children there as well. Any anecdotes about Wild Horses says they were wild guys. And one reason why they didn't turn out so great. And then, of course, we know Brian comes back for this Motorhead album, and he's a problem to Lemmy. They even talk about him almost being too wild even for Motorhead. But
how crazy
Brian,
is that?
Yeah,
how crazy
exactly,
is that?
Yeah. But then Brian doesn't comply with the dress code. He's got the short hair and the headband, and he wears the Hawaiian shirts and the shorts on stage. And this is all just ticking Lemmy off. And of course, it's a one and done for Brian in that. And even guitar wise, he didn't really sort of do what, Motorhead normally does. Although, that album's really come up in estimation with a lot of people. But kind of the last proof is he came back and did this album, Diamonds and Dirt, and it's a pretty good album. But 1983 all the way to today, this is kind of all he's done, right? And now he's officially retired or whatever. But you can tell that that this sort of problem thing, or not being able to work with people, or maybe being unreliable or whatever, or being too bullheaded about certain things, means we didn't see much of Brian Robertson through the years. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good choice for a problem child in the band.
You have to think he's a perfect choice. You have to think, how many decades did we hear absolutely nothing from this guy? Not even a solo album.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
I know. Yeah.
I mean, really, and so many people have such fond memories of this guy and hold him in such high esteem, rightfully so. And it's what is it about these guitar players that came from Thin Lizzy, with the exception of Gary? I hate to mention the other guy because we already talked about him in the last episode, but I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. And also too, I wanted to mention, it's really kind of tragic that of all the things that really derailed Thin Lizzy during that time period, a band that should have been absolutely enormous, and whether it's this incident you explained about with Brian, with the drinking and busting up his hand, or Phil getting, was it tuberculosis or whatever he got, or
jaundice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All these things. I mean, there was always something that derailed them from that ascension that they should have always had, whatever it was. So yeah. Crazy.
Yeah, sorry, I quickly neglected to mention that whole Bad Reputation thing. So of course he's kind of out of the band for Bad Reputation. Scott has to coax him back, or talk Phil into bringing him back, and then he leaves 2 spaces for him, and we get the solos on there. So he's in the band with Bad Reputation, but then he's out of the band for Black Rose, but then he's back, and he's luckily he's back for Live and Dangerous, all of that stuff, but then he's gone again, right? Then it's Snowy White.
Yeah. All right, my choice, first choice for today, is a guy who I guess is a problem child for a different reason. Again, we talked before about a lot of the reasons why we choose some of these folks, and ego, I think, is one of them. Right? There's just guys that historically have tremendous egos. They have a hard time working with other people. They are perfectionists, but they want the spotlight of themselves. So one person that instantly comes to mind when you think of that is Mr. Yngwie Malmsteen. So obviously we know the history there. He gets his first kind of big start in the band Keel. That, he basically had a cup of coffee with Keel and moved on to Alcatraz, which was, I think, the first time people really, really started to notice this young kid from Sweden. He hooks up with Graham Bonnet, who was a known quantity at the time. They released No Parole from Rock and Roll, a great debut album, a great vehicle for not only Graham's vocals, but songwriting. But I mean, man, that guitar playing on that album was, for a lot of people, a game changer. And I think, they went out on tour, they opened up for Ted Nugent, and all of a sudden, Yngwie is starting to hear the Yngwie chants every night. And this young kid is like, all right, I'm a star already, right? So he's got this Rising Force band solo project already in the works. Jeff Scott Soto, who, was an unknown at the time, on vocals. Before you know it, he's saying goodbye to Graham Bonnet, whatever the problems they had, right? Because again, ego, because that's Graham's band. And all of a sudden, this guy Yngwie is, I saw them live on that tour. Yngwie was treating that whole show as if he was the star. Forget Graham Bonnet, nobody cares about him. I'm the guy. That's only going to last so long. And obviously, he went and did his own thing. They released the first Rising Force album, the second album, Marching Out, with Jeff on vocals. You blink and Jeff is gone. In comes Mark Bowles for the third album. You blink, he's gone. Hooks up with Joe Lynn Turner. So again, we have that whole dynamic with a very known quantity, former Rainbow singer. And this, at the time, Yngwie all of a sudden is a big deal, right? He's in all the guitar magazines, on the covers. Everybody's listening to Yngwie. Young guitar players are doing the neoclassical shredding thing. He's getting into verbal spats through the magazines with guys like Dave Menichetti and all these other players, right? All of a sudden, the 80s was this big competition thing. They do the Odyssey album together with Joe Lynn Turner. It's the biggest selling album they have. People are like, wow, this is a great partnership. But all of a sudden, you're starting to hear and see things. Well, those two strong personalities. Can Yngwie play nice with others? And as we saw, no, he can't, because before you know it, Joe is gone. Yngwie goes and brings in a succession of other vocalists. It's almost like every album has a different singer, a different bass player, a different drummer, a different keyboard player. Jens Johansson, the Johansson brothers, and Anders, probably the longest tenured guys in the band, but they didn't last either. And then, you know, you look back, now here we are in 2021, Tim Ripper Owens spent time in there. Anytime he brings in a real known quantity on vocals, it just doesn't last, because Yngwie, I don't think, can have that other really strong personality. I don't even think he wants someone else who's a strong writer, because he wants to control the style and dynamics of the music. And, you know, whether you like it or not, Yngwie has been very stubborn with the type of music that he wants to produce. And you get an Yngwie album, you kind of know what you're going to get, right? He's stuck in, for good or bad, he's stuck in this kind of very gothic, medieval, neoclassical hard rock, right? Which borders on, there's bits of progressive metal in there, classic metal. He loves early progressive rock. He loves classical music. And it's just like, it's this formula that for him really works. You talk to certain fans, they'll listen to anything he puts out and love it. There are some people who loved him early on, but because he never moved past that whole style, have given up on him. Now he's basically got the, LSD lead singer disease, right? He doesn't want to work with singers anymore. I'll just sing, because it's easier, right? I call all the shots. I'm the guy on stage everybody's going to be looking at. I sing, I play. It's all me. I mean, he did a tour recently where he just basically had all backing tracks and him on stage. That's it. Very bizarre. And we've heard many people over the years talk stuff about him, former band members, about how difficult he is to work with and only cares about what he wants. And still, to this day, though, he's considered one of the great guitar players of all time. I absolutely think that he is. I don't always agree with what he does, but I think at this point, he's got to be about our age, Martin, right? So this is what he is. And this is what as long as he continues to record and tour, this is Yngwie Malmsteen. It's this revolving door of personnel. He's calling the shots. He's directing everything. And it is what it is. And I think the tragedy here is that this guy could have been a more household name to the masses, I think, if he would have just checked that ego in a little bit and maybe, worked with that great singer and that great band that could have done 2, 3, 4, 5 albums and really made an impact. You stop and think. I mean, I know they worked together very, very briefly, but there's always been these stories about Ronnie James Dio and Yngwie doing something together, which never happened. Or if, Yngwie and Graham had lasted longer together, or Yngwie and Joe Lynn Turner had lasted longer together, or, Yngwie with Cozy Powell and Ripper Owens. I mean, you think of all these, what could have been, and instead he just keeps doing his thing and, to middling success, I guess. But I think most people who have been involved with him would call him somewhat of a problem child. And again, whether it's ego or whether it's his, everything's got to be just perfect and exactly as he wants it. Whatever the case, he's another perfect choice, I think, for this program.
Yeah, I'll mention one story. I might have mentioned this before, but probably not told it in this sort of way. But I just remember this kind of tells you what a star and a talent he is, obviously with many of the flaws that you mentioned there, right? Without knowing that he could be a bigger star with songs with collaboration. But here, the funny thing, this happened in Toronto here once. So I'm on the bus with him. We're doing an interview. We're just talking. It's relaxed. We're talking about Queen. We're talking about his influences. We're talking about Deep Purple for 10 minutes in a row and all this stuff, just sitting on the bus. 45 minutes later, he goes, "Yeah, Martin, you're going to see a really special show tonight." And he kind of chuckles, right? And lo and behold, then he goes to explain, I don't even know how much he explained it, but he just said, "You can see a pretty special show tonight." So I can't remember where it went from there, or whether the topic changed or whatever. But that night he goes on stage. His lead singer had just quit, and he's going to sing every song. It's a trio. He goes on stage as a trio. Now, you would think he'd be a little frantic and checking his crib notes and getting a little nervous and getting ready for the show. No, he's just got all the time in the world just to sit on the bus and talk about Queen and Deep Purple. And it's like, yeah, Martin, you're going to see a pretty special show tonight.
I'm throwing it together the last minute.
Yeah, really. It's like, and so that is quite impressive that he can go up there and sing, and he's a good singer and he can sing on these albums and stuff. It's a bit of the John Sykes story, I suppose, right? So, I mean, he's a huge talent to also be able to do that, but to sing these songs and to go on stage just impromptu and obviously not even be very worried about it, sort of thing. So, anyways, that's all I'll say about Yngwie. But
and another thing I didn't even mention, it's like, he for years would talk about how he was never really into Richie Blackmore, influenced by him at all. And he's millions of times, he was, not millions, but plenty of times. And then he puts out that Inspirations album, and like a quarter of the songs are all like Deep Purple or Rainbow covers.
Yeah.
I'm like, come on, man. It's like, it's okay to say it. It really is. It's like we all were influenced by something, right?
Yeah. One last thing I'll mention about Yngwie, and this came up again, and it's happened a few times at any time I talked to him, but the very recent time I talked to him just for this last album, he totally realizes he's put here on this earth to make that kind of specific guitar music. And that's it. No apologies. I'm just going to give you more and more and more and more of it, because that's my one very specific goal in life. That's what he thinks.
And you know what? And for most of his fans, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. I think that he could have been a little more than that.
Yeah.
I think, because he has shown, there have been times where he has done records that I think had that, and I don't want to necessarily say mainstreamy, but like had the ability to reach a wider audience that's just not folks who just want to hear that over and over and over again, right? I mean, the Odyssey album, the Marching Out album, I mean, those are like really strong records that I think had that ability to reach a wider audience. I think even if him and Ripper would have stuck together a little longer, because those albums are pretty good too. But again, it's just, like you said, he's just very happy with doing what he says he's been put on this earth to do, and I'll just make the same album over and over and over again with little bits of variations here and there, and it's like, and it's cool, right? Because I mean, I like all that stuff too, but I don't know. I just think this is a perfect example of what could have been, because he was the man there for a couple of years.
It's really funny though, when what you described there is almost, he would look at that and say, but that's like a different occupation. He almost considers himself, he's almost like the violinist in your big city symphony, just there purely to play music. And whatever level of obscurity that causes, that's fine with him. Obviously, it's bigger than the second violinist in the Toronto Symphony Orchestra or whatever, right? But it's not like you say, a superstar thing. He would look at that and say, that's a different job. That's a different occupation. Being a guy in a band. That's not me. I'm a musician. That's what I do. So.
Yeah. Hey, if he's happy with it, that's cool.
Yeah. All right. My second choice for a problem child is Kevin Dubrow. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. I know we've talked about him a little bit before in other contexts, but and I know I've even because I noticed this was tucked into my thing. I've got this letter here that I think I've read a little bit from before, but I just looked at it again this morning, and I think this is just really kind of interesting. So this is a press release. It's very short. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's very short. Quiet Riot fires Kevin Dubrow. Burbank, February 5th, 1987. Multi-platinum Pasha CBS recording group Quiet Riot has fired its lead singer, Kevin Dubrow. It was announced today. Group members Frankie Benali, Carlos Cavazzo, and Chuck Wright stated that the split was not amicable and cited severe personality and musical differences as the basis for termination. It got to the point where we felt Kevin had been a very serious detriment to Quiet Riot, a spokesman for the group said. He continued to alienate not only the group's friends and supporters in the industry, but their fans, the people who have always meant the most to them. Everyone finally got fed up with the friction and embarrassing conditions they found themselves in because of Kevin. After many failed attempts at righting the situation, it was decided that terminating Kevin's relationship with Quiet Riot was the only solution. As Kevin used to say to the group, the record company, the management, the road crew, booking agents, concert promoters, disc jockeys, everybody, it's my way or the highway. Well, the group took his cue and sent him packing. Quiet Riot is currently in the studio writing material for its next album. Will announce its new lead singer shortly. So to do a press release that the entire thing is that, you got to be a problem child. And I remember as a kid in 1983, I would have been 20, reading all those magazines. I never really cottoned on to how much of a problem he was. It just sort of came out later. And I even looked for a bunch of anecdotes on the internet before, doing this. And I couldn't really find that many. I found some Frankie Benelli stuff because Frankie also could be kind of a dick to a lot of people, apparently. And I've got a notorious interview I did with some old roadie guy, which I'm not going to repeat the story, but he got his revenge on Frankie. Let's put it that way, in a certain way. But we know Kevin was there in the beginning, and then he's there on the big album. This is the famous 6 times platinum. There's a picture of Kevin there. We know the whole story about the balding and then getting the wigs and all that stuff. He's there in the follow-up. He's there on the next one, and then he's there on QR3, but he's gone on QR. But then he comes back. And in his defense, I would like to say that he was always super nice to me, as was Frankie. Frankie was amazing. He's Mr. Service. You email him, sadly he's gone now, but you would email him and 5 minutes later you'd get a long email back. Like, he was so good with just taking care of business, right? And Kevin, sadly, we know he died of a cocaine overdose, and that surprised kind of everybody. It was later in years, and he was on a bunch of those later Quiet Riot albums. And yeah, anytime I got to talk to him, hang out with him on the bus, he was the nicest guy you could ever believe. So maybe this is something that changed over time. Although later I also heard, stories of fans approaching him later and getting brushed off and stuff like that as well. But I think that letter says everything. And I'm sure if we dig long enough, there are a lot of horror stories about Kevin. But yes, apparently, obviously they could have been a much, much bigger band, but they went from 6 times platinum to platinum to no certification to him not being in a band. So had he not been whatever it was he was, the problem child, they could have been bigger.
Yeah, I ran into him. I might have told this story on the air before. I ran into him in Las Vegas in a restaurant in Caesar's Palace, like early 90s. I'd say probably 93, maybe 94 at the latest. So I don't really know like what was going on with the band around that time. Right. But he was walking out of the restaurant as I was going in, and he had this like totally amazing blonde with him, right? But this was the time where he was doing the full wig thing. He had this mass of hair that was just like all over the place, and he was like completely hammered. But I recognized him instantly. I stopped him to say hello, and he said hello, and exchanged quick pleasantries, and then away they went. But he was obviously having himself a good time, and that was the only chance I ever had to meet him. But it was like, wow, Kevin Dubrow. And then in the early 90s, you're thinking, remember that guy? Because nobody cared about Quiet Riot in the 90s, right? I mean, just like kind of forgotten.
Yeah.
All righty, my next choice, Tom Schultz from Boston.
Okay.
Probably, yeah. I mean, this is a problem child of a different nature, right? This is a guy who I think probably the record label hated because he was so difficult to work with as far as like producing product. Band members probably hated working with him because he was such a perfectionist. So of course, that first Boston album comes out, sells a gazillion copies, one of the best debuts of all time. The band becomes, almost overnight enormous. And, was Epic Records, right? They want to follow up like real quick. And Lord only knows how much time Tom worked on that debut album before they actually, got signed and delivered that. So I'm assuming that was probably in the works for a bunch of years based on the meticulousness and the perfectness of the whole thing. So the band goes back into the studio, or I guess, depending on what you read from Who, he went back into the studio because there's all sorts of talk that the bulk of what you hear on those Boston albums is basically just him. To do the follow-up, Don't Look Back, and he is getting pressure, like, because the label wanted within a year wanted that follow-up, because this is the 70s, right? 70s, you follow up big albums, you follow them up quickly. Got to strike while the iron's hot. There, you can't have a multi-platinum album and not crank another one out in a year or two. Just can't do it. So he goes back to work on Don't Look Back. He's getting all sorts of pressure from the label to get this thing out. They finally released that. I think it was 2 years, right, Martin? I think Don't Look Back came out right about
78. Yep.
Yeah, 2-year mark. He's unhappy with it because he felt he was forced to release that to them as it was, and he thought that there should have been more work done on it. Okay, so the album does really well, not quite as well as that debut. It's funny how most people, look at Don't Look Back as a failure, but is 7 million copies a failure or whatever it was? It's quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
So by this time, he's already kind of alienating lots of a bunch of the band members. Some guys stay, some guys go. We don't see another Boston album for another bunch of years. We go into the 80s. Then we got a different lineup. Barry Goodrow's not around anymore. Sib is not around anymore. Is Fran around anymore? Who knows? He brings in new guys. He does most of the album. So all of a sudden, now he's again pissing off the record label. There's a litigation against the label. Management comes and goes. Band members come and go. And now all of a sudden we see this pattern of, we're going to get a new Boston album, maybe in 7-8 years. And I mean, the funny thing is, you would think most other bands, 7-8 years, you're forgotten. Ironically enough, the general public and the fans, they buy those new albums when they come out, because it's almost like an event. Like once a decade, we're going to see a new Boston album. Don't know who's on it, but we're going to buy it anyway. And that has kind of followed this band, or him, I should say, all these years. And he now has that kind of also reputation for the anti-rock star. It's like this guy, he's got this band, he puts out these albums, he makes lots of money, but he doesn't want to be like everybody else. He doesn't really want to do the tours. He doesn't want to do the interviews. He just wants to sit in his studio and work on his little pet project for a decade and then give it to us. Right. And I think that has upset not only fans, but obviously band members, management, labels. And he's kind of looked at, I think, these days as the uncool mad scientist of rock and roll. Does he care? He probably doesn't, because I'm sure he's got plenty of money. And, just when you think that you've seen the last of Boston, out comes another album, and he uses vocals that he had tracks of from Brad Delp, who hasn't been with us in quite a while. And you hear these new recordings, and it's almost kind of creepy in a weird way, right? Because it's like he's constantly dipping into the vaults to recreate magic from 1976. But yet people are still interested in hearing what might come next from these guys. So he's my second choice for today, Tom Schultz. Kind of a weird one, but I don't think anybody would deny that he was kind of difficult to work with in some form or another, as brilliant as he might be.
Yeah. I just got a press release about Tom, and with a lot of quotes from Tom, and he acknowledges his difficulty, and people are mad at me all the time for various things. And what it doesn't say in it is, I think the main reason fans are mad at him now is that he thinks, we love the Mad Genius stuff and we love the production, but we don't like, no matter how much explaining he does or how well he does it, we don't like the idea of using a drum machine, right? We want to hear a full band, and we want to know there's a drummer there. But you talk about creepy. That's a perfect word for even the drum machine end of it. It's like he's saying robots can do this whole job better. And my next challenge is I'm going to replace myself, right? Or whatever, right?
So you're going to take 10 years to give us a drum machine.
Exactly. And he, I've talked to him, I've interviewed him before, and he's like, swears up and down, no, I do this, and every single snare and every cymbal is different. I don't know if you can tell that, he says, but everything's different. So it's made to be really, really, really human, right? But it's like you listen to it as a fan, and he's now, more emphasis on the mad end of the mad genius, mad scientist thing. He can't even hear it when any novice can totally hear that it's a drum machine.
Yeah.
And we know it's a drum machine. He's not trying to hide it either, right? So that's the thing. I mean, these albums are now flawed in just this completely, totally basic way. That's the thing that's ticking off us deep fans more than anything.
They're almost like they're an awkward listen, because they're just, it sounds like like he's taken like the pieces of a puzzle and thrown them up in the air, and he's taken the pieces from many different puzzles from different eras, and it all sounds really pieced together. It's like, oh, I've heard that melody before. Oh, that sounds like a guitar riff we've heard before. And oh, that vocal line, it sounds like Brad, but it's not Brad. Or it sounds like Brad from 30 years ago, but he's been dead for 20 years. It's like weird. It's just kind of weird. And you hear moments of brilliance on some of these latter records, but you listen to them through and through, and you're like, God, it's hauntingly just odd to me when you look at specifically those first two albums, which are classics. I'd even argue the third album is pretty damn good. But even that one sounds a little creepy to me. Like, we listen to Third Stage, there's stuff on there that's like, is this the same band, or is this just that the mad scientist trying to make you believe that it's the same band, right? But it's not. We know here that it's not. We know here that it's not.
Yeah,
very strange.
And even the album covers aren't great. They've got that kind of like rushed computer graphics look to them. So it's almost like Yngwie driving around on his Ferrari, but just putting regular gas in it, right? And it's hiccuping down the road and all that stuff, right? Pinging and all that, right? So it's just odd that he's this meticulous guy. Yet here's my album cover and here's some drum machine on it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. All right.
Saying all that, I saw them live, like, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. When they did the last tour. And again, he's got like this whole cast of people to recreate the original sound. Mm-hmm. It was amazing. It was so much fun. I had never seen them before. Yeah. So go figure, right? It's like, you can still have fun with it, but as far as like hearing the albums, it's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. All right. My next choice is Steven Tyler. Now, obviously he's the leader of Aerosmith. He's the reason they are so great. He's an amazing lyricist. He's an amazing vocalist. He's one of the greatest frontmen of all time. He looks great. Even still now, he looks like a cool rock star, right? Into his 70s or whatever, right? But he is a problem for a number of ways with this band. I mean, he definitely has the reputation, and unfortunately, it's growing now just for no good reason. He lives in Hawaii, by the way, incidentally. It's kind of odd.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
But he has a reputation for not being a very nice guy. And in the old days, it was the drugs talking in a lot of ways. Plus they were very competitive, and there was always the fighting. Everybody was always grouchy all the time and tired and strung out and all that stuff. Right. But he does unfortunately have this reputation as that. And he also is a problem child in this band, in that, not so much it's my way or the highway. He's been a very important part of making things work. Like, for example, when they're having guitar problems and still a great record like this comes out. There's Steven right there. But a few ways he's a problem child is obviously the not very nice guy. The being on drugs and very unreliable when it got super dark, starting in around 70, 78, I'd say 77, all the way up until about 85. But also things like being just last minute coming with the lyrics. I know there's one apocryphal story about him having either briefcase or a notebook of his lyrics and just losing it, in a unorganized haze or whatever. But he was always known to be really late with the lyrics and stingy and not getting them, done. So he was not reliable. But he's also the guy who's the guy in the band pushing the big power ballads. This isn't exactly Living on the Edge, but you're crazy, you're crying, your abomination of an album like Just Push Play. he's the guy in the band known for it's got to have 4 or 5 of these big, huge ballads on it, and we'll work with outside guys, and I'll even do a country album as my solo album or whatever. So I really do believe, and in talking to the various guys, you do get a hint of this, that the likes of a Joe Perry and certainly a Tom Hamilton and a Brad Whitford, and if Joey Kramer's in the band at this point, who knows? But all these guys would probably make a more rocking album, and Aerosmith would have back their reputation. That's the one thing they don't have anymore, is they have lost their reputation. They would have all of that back, I think, if those 4 guys got their way, versus Steven Tyler, who just keeps it in this, ridiculously corporate, commercial, try to be everything to everybody, but then you're nothing to nobody, putting out these 70-minute albums with a bunch of stuff that no one wants to hear, yet it causes it to sell, blah, blah, blah. He's the guy that's the problem. He's the guy, unfortunately, ironically, because he is the golden goose in the band as well. He's obviously the most unreplaceable guy in the band, but he is also the guy, I think, who has caused them to lose their reputation.
Well, he forgot how to be a team player.
Yeah.
It's all about me. It's all about Steven now, right? Because I've heard plenty of stories of, he was trying, he did that like solo album, that kind of crossover country album, which isn't terrible for what it is. It's, it's not what you'd expect from him, but I've read plenty of things that he was trying to push that as something he wanted the band to do. Can't do that. Yeah. Can't do that. And you have to wonder, the direction. You basically said it already. It's like the direction of much of the latter period Aerosmith output has been really pushed by him. And it obviously doesn't work for the hardcore fan base, right? But yeah, it's a shame. You're right. Could you imagine if the rest of the guys did an album without him? What it would sound like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember, there were those rumors at one point for 5 minutes, right? And I was actually excited about it. It's like, wow, Aerosmith get a new singer. Kind of cool idea. Let's try it.
You can't hurt, right?
Yeah.
Can't hurt. You mentioned grumpy before. I don't think grumpy applies to anyone more than this guy. How about Ginger Baker?
Nice one, yeah.
This guy, if anybody has not seen the Beware of Mr. Baker documentary film, you got to watch it. This guy, it was as cantankerous and crusty as it gets. And again, I know that film centers on him at, latter part of his life, but you start to read up a little bit on the history of this guy, and problems followed him all throughout his life. What's really interesting is if you go way back to when, he had this love-hate relationship with Jack Bruce. And I don't know who was the more problem child out of this duo here, but they played together in Blues Incorporated and the Graham Bond organization back in the early mid 60s before Cream, and they hated each other and couldn't get along then. So why? I'm happy they did, because we got Cream for a couple of years, right? But these guys detest each other, and yet they go form another band together with Eric Clapton, who, Cream is huge. But again, they couldn't get along there either, right? So then you start to wonder, it's like, all right, is something wrong with this dude? A phenomenal drummer. I think Ginger Baker was one of the greats. I love his drumming. I normally don't focus on drummers, but I love to listen to Ginger. So after Cream breaks up, him and Eric put together the supergroup Blind Faith. That lasts, a little over a year, right? That implodes. He forms Ginger Baker's Air Force, because the guy kept busy. Got to give him credit for that. That doesn't last long. He goes off to Africa and he does a bunch of weird African albums. He lives there, whatever. During this time, develops a heroin addiction. He gets married and divorced a whole bunch of times. He puts together the Baker Gurvitz Army, which I think was a fabulous group. That lasted a couple albums. That was it. He joins Hawkwind for a brief period in time for a great album in Levitation. That doesn't last. He shows up as the drummer for this really cool 80s band called Masters of Reality, which, arguably one of the cool early kind of stoner bands, right? That doesn't last. He gets back together again with Jack Bruce, this time with Gary Moore for the BBM thing. A fine album. That could have been something. It wasn't. The big Cream reunion for obviously lots of dough. That lasted a brief time. That probably was only ever meant to be. And there's more. I'm not even mentioning all of it. But everybody you read up on who had interactions with him always say what a strange character he was. I'm sure if Jack Bruce was still around, he'd probably say something a little bit deeper than that. But if you watch the film, Beware of Mr. Baker, this guy was just a cranky old bastard. And I think that, and he had his addiction problems, which probably exacerbated that whole thing. But a fine talent who I always got the impression, again, not knowing the man, that he had commitment issues. And he also wanted to kind of work by the beat of his own drum, and he just had a hard time playing with others. But watch the film. Guy was obviously a character, but what a drummer regardless. But it's just amazing. If you go and look at his career, sometimes you can really tell like who were the dudes who just had a hard time committing or working with others by the sheer size of their discography and their recorded works, because they don't hang around anywhere long enough because they just physically can't. So, but I think if you go back and look at the career here of him, I think the one instance where I think that I would have liked to have seen more of was him and Hawkwind. I thought was a really good marriage. And I think because those guys are kind of weird too and kind of hard to get along with. So why couldn't, but again, you throw a bunch of cranky old bastards together, it's not going to last long. So there you have it.
Yeah. I'll add that Jack Bruce definitely had an edge to him as well. I ticked him off once definitely. But the other funny thing about Cream is that, it's often said, I remember kind of, I can't remember how this works today, but there were a bunch of guys I remember when we were doing the Metal Evolution episodes for Banger Films, but Cream came together during the birth of the PA systems, right? And there's three guys with big egos. It's a trio. It's a power trio. And lo and behold, they're all competing with each other for volume. They're just louder and louder and louder. And it was ridiculous, the stories that would go back and forth about these guys trying to out volume each other. So you got drums, bass, guitar, but vocals kind of for the first time. Vocals and drums sort of for the first time when you get the birth of PAs, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so that caused problems as well. But the movie's hilarious, isn't it?
It is. I couldn't believe what I was seeing for half of it. I'm like, my God, this guy is a freaking mess. Holy cow.
Yeah. All right. So my next choice is Ace Frehley. So, I almost went with Peter Criss because I thought one of the stories about Ace Frehley, obviously, how he's kind of a thorn in their side rather than a problem child. He's somewhat of a problem child, but more of a thorn in Kiss's side is because remember the old solo album situation. This is why I almost went with Peter, because Peter is embarrassing the band with his solo album, and Ace is showing up the band with everybody saying, "Oh my God, Ace, your solo album is the best of all of them," right? Much to the chagrin of Gene and Paul, right? So he's a thorn in their side immediately, but he's also like the wild guy, the wild rock and roller, the party guy, the drinking too much guy. But so is Peter, right? And Peter is actually you can add kind of like a roust about violent nature to Peter as well on top of that. Whereas Ace, you didn't really get that. You just got the kind of embarrassing drunk guy with the
he's a goofball. Yeah, he's
the curly voice, right? Yep. With the curly laugh, right? Yep. So you'd see it on those interviews you can see on YouTube when they're on TV and stuff, and you can see Gene and Paul kind of rolling their head at Ace is kind of like trying to have a sense of humor, but he's not articulate enough to actually have a proper sense of humor, right? Whereas Gene's a perfectly articulate guy, and he could be funny and engaging and smart and all that stuff, and Paul's just charming, right? But Ace, he's a thorn in their side by having the better album. He's also like drunk and unreliable, and the falling down Ace Frehley, and where these guys are trying to keep it together. And then later on, when he's out of the band, he still continues to make music that gets compared to Kiss. I mean, not all that completely favorably to Kiss, but he also continues to be a thorn in their side because he'll just shoot from the hip. He'll say it how it is. And so will Peter. So they're both like still thorns in their sides. Those two guys are not scared of Paul and Gene, right? They'll just say whatever they want. They'll talk about the money, right? And all that stuff. And then of course they they do the reunion for this album, which is not a very good album. And this thing doesn't last very long. And then they're already still all fighting again. And Peter's still out there, embarrassing the band with his solo albums, right? It's like, it's like every time Peter puts out music, it's like everybody thinks, how did that guy last in Kiss? He obviously doesn't like this kind of music. Like, what was he doing there? Right. And then every time you talk to him, he'd be talking about Gene Krupa and all this. It's like, oh, I'm such a jazz guy and all this stuff. Right. Whereas, he was not much of a jazzy guy in Kiss, right? So you had those two problem childs in the band. And then I thought about the rest of Kiss and realized there's not really any other problem childs in the band. And you could say at various times, Paul and Gene, maybe more so Gene, is a bit of a problem child. But I think Ace is definitely the key thorn in the side for Kiss.
I think you could probably make a case for Vinnie Vincent to an extent. Too.
Oh yeah, right. I forgot about Vinny. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's actually a good one, and obviously what he's done in later years. You're right.
Oh yeah. I mean, either Ace or Peter is a perfect choice here. Yeah, I just don't understand. To me, Peter had the best voice out of all of them on all those classic Kiss records. And he had the perfect voice for that kind of music, raspy and powerful. And then that solo album came out and all these other albums he's done since. I'm like, what? But that's what he likes. That's really where his love is. But I've never seen a guy who just refused and is so stubborn to just, realize that he's got a voice that's perfectly suitable for a style of rock and roll, and he just doesn't want to do it. Yeah. Did it in Kiss, and it worked, but he refuses to replicate that. And now it's probably way too late. But yeah. And
that's such a good point. I never thought of that. I mean, he could have been like a Rod Stewart star, right?
Absolutely.
Imagine 7 or 8, hard rock. Peter Criss, just a singer. Forget the drums. I got a new drummer. This guy's our drummer now. I'm just Peter Criss, the singer, right?
He could have done stuff like the Faces or the Jeff Beck Group, and it would have been massive. His voice was perfectly suited for that, like Humble Pie type of stuff. And instead, he's tossing and turning. I'm like, what is this garbage? Yeah, it's just unbelievable. I will say, some of the funniest stuff you'll ever see is to go watch those old talk show clips with the band and seeing Ace just being a total goofball and just embarrassing the other guys. I mean, that's just classic. This classic, and all the stories of him not showing up to recording sessions and the producers just bringing in other guys to play his parts. I mean, that must have drove them nuts after a while. Anyway, all right, my next choice, a guy who was in the original lineup of Metallica and obviously had all sorts of drinking and substance abuse problems that eventually led to, depending on who you talk to, getting booted from the band or him leaving the band. There's the story of Metallica putting Dave Mustaine on a bus and sending him from New York back to LA with his guitar and go home, cry in your bed, and we got to move on without you. So whatever the story is, Dave Mustaine, whether in Metallica or even in Megadeth, has had a history of being the problem child. So we obviously know his issues with Metallica stemmed from unreliability due to excessive drinking. But then once he leaves the band, he eventually puts together Megadeth. And as we've seen all these years, lots of shuffling lineups, lots of conflict with other guitar players because he's always insisted that it has to be a 2-guitar band. Originally there's clashes with folks like Chris Poland, Jeff Young. He's had clashes with his original bass player on and off with Dave Ellefson over the years. There's been many stories documented about Dave's descent into serious, drug addiction, right? Because initially it was the alcohol problem, but then all of a sudden he's doing, heroin and cocaine and all that sort of stuff. Goes to rehab, gets out of rehab, gets back into the drugs. The band is a really big deal for quite a while. I mean, they're arguably one of the biggest metal bands on the planet, certainly one of the thrash bands, puts together the Rust in Peace lineup, considered probably their best. A couple of years later, they go on and get that opening slot on the Aerosmith tour. But of course, Dave, because of the issues he's having or whatever, just kind of can't keep his mouth shut on stuff, pisses off the guys in Aerosmith. They get kicked off the tour. He's, reignites the whole feud with Metallica years later. Eventually, they have somewhat of a kiss and make up type of thing for that whatever, Gods and Monsters, whatever the hell film it's called, right? And then now there's like, okay, we can kind of get along. But it just seems like he's always in the news for something or another. The constant changing of lineups. I mean, he's worked with some tremendous guitar players. None of them seem to want to stick around for too long. All right. It's almost like they go and Megadeth, they make a name for themselves, and then they got to move on to something else quickly because I guess, working with Dave Mustaine is probably not easy. He's battled cancer in recent years. Apparently, he's fought past that. We've now had another incident with Dave Ellefson. Maybe he's a problem child too. The whole incident with him and the video of him doing, what he did. He's now out of the band. So I think it's safe to say that Dave Mustaine, no matter who is in his band or what he's doing, whether he's sober or not, he's going to be a controversial figure to the end. That's just the way he is. So whether it's something he says, something he does, or what he's consuming, he is a problem child through and through.
Yeah, and another interesting thing is, before Alex Jones probably was even more persona non grata than he used to be. Dave would go on Alex's show, right? And they were buddies. They would hang out and stuff. So he had a few of those conspiracy theory type, pursuits. I mean, all that stuff's pretty interesting. But and also, to be fair, I think Dave would not go down the rabbit hole with Alex in most cases. He stayed pretty sane, in any of those conversations, and he wouldn't be dragged into anything, too heavy. But yeah, so he had that going for him as well. And the Metallica thing was always, he almost seemed like obsessed with it a lot. If he was asked about it, he would talk about it a lot, and he would not realize, this is what I've always said about that whole situation, is for a very brief time there, for a couple of albums in a row, Rust and Peace and Countdown, Dave doesn't really appreciate that Megadeth was a better band than Metallica.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. They were cooler. They were more beloved. They were more technical. The productions were amazing. They were accessible. They were thoughtful. The lyrics were good. So for a while there, Dave needs to realize that Megadeth was actually a better band.
And, as fans, we all thought that. We were all, around that time period, we were like, who cares what Metallica's doing? Yeah. You are the man now. You have the best band in this thing called thrash, right? Yeah. And don't give it up. Move on from it. And he was really, it's seemingly unable to, because that was like the baddest band on the planet he had at that point in time.
And if you think about it, the debut didn't do that well, but Peace Sells did well, and So Far So Good did well.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you've got Master and you've got Justice. And then Rust and Peace comes out in 89. Is it 90, 89? Anyways, it's before the Black Album. So, for 2.5 years there, Megadeth is as big a band as Metallica is, right? Yeah. And then Metallica takes off, but it's like, number one, you're as good as Metallica and you're as big, if not bigger than Metallica for a little while. So yeah, it's kind of odd. And yet he just, I think he sees the success of Metallica and that ticks him off more than anything.
Well, yeah, because I think
so much bigger than his band. Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I think too, because he was such an important part of the early Metallica machine, he helped write a lot of those riffs and things from those first two albums. Right. So I think he just feels that they were unjust in kicking me out of the band when they could have helped me get through that period. But as history shows, he developed even deeper problems. So were they ever going to be able to save him from that?
Yeah.
You can't blame them, right? It's like they needed to kind of get their shit together and do what they wanted to do. You seem to be incapable of it, right? And as it showed, that he went through spiraling issues for about a decade after that. So
yeah. All right. Okay, my last one is Vince Neil, Motley Crue. So Vince Neil definitely has been enough of a problem to the point where Motley Crue even had to kick him out. His ambition level never seemed quite as high as, well, Nikki, who's running the thing, Tommy is actually a pretty thoughtful, intelligent, decent guy, and he's also very into music and the drumming. And obviously he went off into a hip hop thing and he got a lot of heck for that. But he obviously is quite a musical guy. And Mick Mars is there as well, being a kind of a key writer for the band. So Vince always seemed like a little bit of the David Lee Roth, I suppose, in the band, to the point where they had to get rid of him and do this album. And then, of course, he's back for this. But he kind of remains the problem child in the band because they feel that he's still not putting in the work to lose the weight and sing better and all that. And he's obviously gotten over the years a massive reputation for these horrendous live clips that are all over YouTube of him not being able to sing, not putting in the effort, putting on short shows, and also that thing that he totally could fix if he wanted to, singing more of the actual lyrics, right?
Yeah, it's like he doesn't even care.
Yeah. It's gotten so comical that he's like, you're the one who's that, and and it's like he does that so much, and that really ticks off the fans, because that's not even, okay, I'm losing my voice, that's I don't care. Right. Yeah. And that's what drives people crazy a lot. So he's definitely a problem child, and his reputation's kind of at an all-time low at this point. And it's a lot of the reason that Motley has so much bad blood. I mean, there are the Nicky personality problems and all that kind of thing as well. And, all of the scandals they've all been through, more or less, except for Mick Mars. But Tommy's been through a lot of scandals as well. Let's not forget the drummer Razzle dying, while Vince is driving the car, and Hannah Rocks loses their drummer, and it shatters the band when they were just about to be absolutely huge on the Two Steps for the Move album. Arguably they would have gotten big, but they were signed to CBS. So there's that situation as well. But yeah, it just feels a little bit like in a band of three problem childs at various points in time. He's the biggest problem child in Motley.
Yeah, good choice. All right, my last one for today. Gonna go with another drummer here. He was the wild and crazy guy in one of the biggest bands of the 70s, The Who, none other than Keith Moon. If you've ever read, there's a book, I believe it's just called Moon. I forget who wrote it. Looking at it over on my shelf right now. If you ever wanted to hear some of the craziest rock and roll stories of all time, go read that book. Keith Moon was one of those guys, an important cog in that Who machine. And I think, Martin, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where you had a band like The Who had these four really strong, distinct personalities that seemingly on the surface shouldn't work together, but you had to have all four of them to make the kind of, music that they did, whether it be in the studio or certainly live on stage. And, Keith Moon, I think, deep down inside was always like the class clown, right? He was the guy the prankster who'd like to play jokes on people. And if you go watch like any of the old interview footage of The Who back in the late 60s and the 70s, and he's the guy who's doing all the talk, and he's the guy who's telling the jokes and playing around with the interviewer and whatnot. But behind the scenes, he had all sorts of crazy demons. I mean, he was a ridiculous alcoholic for many years. In fact, it's what really did him in at the end. He had also various drug problems. He was just loved to live life to the fullest. He was a partier, and he wanted to be the center of attention at all times. I mean, if you look at him on any live clip, or if you've seen him live, I mean, his drum style says, "Look at me." Right. I think deep down inside, he had lots of issues about acceptance deep down inside. Sometimes guys who act this way, or people who act this way, they've got some insecurities that they're dealing with. But, all the stories of him, driving cars into pools and wrecking hotel rooms. And, he was the poster child for the excesses of the 70s, to the point, though, where it became a problem for the band because he became very unreliable on stage and in the studio. If you see any footage of the last couple of years of his life, whether studio footage or live, you can see here was this guy who was, I think, barely 30 years old, and he looked like he was in his 50s. I mean, he was overweight, he had aged tremendously, and all of a sudden that wild flailing style, all of a sudden not really there anymore. So I think that we really saw Keith Moon slowly dying right in front of our eyes for the last like 2 or 3 years of his life, when finally he did succumb to his addictions. But one of those guys that, for me anyway, once he passed and you took him out of that equation of the Who, I don't think that band was ever the same. Kenny Jones, fine drummer. They did some fine music with him afterwards, but it was never the same because, again, like we said, you had these 4 distinct personalities that made this band the supergroup that they were. And you take one of them out and it's like there's something missing. And that was the unpredictable nature of Keith Moon, which is the way he lived his life on stage and off stage. And that's what made him so great. So I don't know if we ever, if Keith Moon any other way would have ever been good enough. But as it was, I'm sure, could you imagine having to deal with him, like being in a band with him and having to manage him like all those years? That must have been interesting. And I've read things in books on Pete Townsend, about Pete Townsend, and he talks about that quite a bit. But that's what made Keith so great. So.
Yeah, and you do see quotes throughout the years from John and Pete disparaging Keith somewhat. I mean, they obviously have voiced that they were ticked off at him at many times during all that as well, right? And the unpredictability is interesting also because it's right there in the drumming style. Like he does so many strange things on the drums that you think, oh, I can't believe he's going to go there, he's going to do that, or he's going to start the fill now, or whatever, right? And it worked because Pete's guitar style was a pullback kind of style, like an Alex Lifeson or whatever, right? So he's a colorizer and a texturizer and all that stuff, and doing licks rather than riffs. And if he's doing riffs, they're not going to be the same next time. He's going to be a little all over the place, little like Eddie Van Halen as well.
Yeah.
And so that worked. So you had a lead guitarist, the only guitarist, whether he's playing lead or rhythm or whatever, but he's a guitarist that pulls back on the leadness of it, and Keith pulls forward on the leadness of it, and John pulls forward on the leadness of it. He's got a big ego as well, right?
Yeah.
He's a problem child in that band as well, for sure.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I mean, the dynamic within those dudes was really different because, in most bands like that, you see like the bassist and the drummer kind of working side by side quite a bit. But I've watched a ton of footage of the Who. I very rarely ever saw Entwistle really locked in with Keith, but yet Townsend always was. Townsend and Moon were always the guys feeding off each other, looking at each other, playing off each other. That's not something you really see that often.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Cool.
All right. We both have a couple honorable mentions we'll throw out there. So Martin, what do you got?
Well, I had kind of a long list of ones that, were problematic for various ways here, but I'll just go through them real quick and not really say why, more or less. But Stephen Pearcy, Axl Rose, Don Dokken, you talked about Vinnie Vincent before, Glenn Buxton's pretty clear example, Blackie Lawless, leader of Wasp, but a problem in his own right. UFO was a hard one. I didn't really want to call Pete Way and Paul Chapman problem childs in this band, but in certain ways they are. Cozy Powell can be a bit of a problem. He's very opinionated. Mike Patton, very artistic. Rob Halford, kind of for the Bruce Dickinson reason for leaving, but not really a problem child. CeCe DeVille in Poison, Steven Wilson for leaving and doing the Joe Bonamassa thing in a way, right? Stopping this golden goose from operating, right? Although they're operating again. Yep. Paul Weller in the Jam, Morrissey and the Smiths. That's about all I got. There you go.
Cool. Yeah, cool. For me, I got two guys from the Allman Brothers. I say Greg Allman and Dickie Betts. Both have been problems in that band in the past. Dennis DeYoung and Styx. Jeff Tate and Queensryche. Keith Richards in the Stones, although you could arguably say Mick as well, right? I think Jagger has been a problem child in that band as well. Yeah. And you mentioned Vinnie Vincent and Axl Rose. I had those as well. So that's all I got.
Cool. Excellent.
Cool. So thanks for watching, everybody. This has been fun talking about some of these guys. And I think the important thing is we love these guys. We really do, but we fully recognize that they probably haven't been the easiest to work with. So thanks for watching. So let's divulge what we have coming up next week. So many of you have asked over the last few months for a return to album covers. So we are going to do that, but we are going to be very specific. So we are going to take a look at the works of Hipgnosis. And starting next week, next Friday, Martin and I will each be talking about, I think we're starting with 10, right? Our 10 favorite Hipgnosis
10
covers.
each, right? We're doing 10 each.
10 each,
Right?
yep.
I think
10
so, yeah.
each. And we're each going to try and pick different ones so we can do lots of coverage, because quite frankly, there's a million covers from Hipgnosis that I personally love. So, it'll be good if we show off and talk about different stuff. And then we'll see where that goes for a part 2. Maybe we'll dip into our least favorites as well. So that's coming up. So Martin, you've got some new stuff going on with books and things and episodes and whatnot, right?
Yeah, the big thing that happened. I did have the last History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff podcast was about British bands in the 90s. We talked about a lot at Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, and we're excited about. So there I've got, I kind of do a little tribute to Skyclad, Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, Napalm Death, who I love and should listen to a lot more. I mean, Napalm Death is awesome. And then who is the other one? I don't know, something like, maybe that's 5. But the other big thing that happened is 2 days ago, I just got in the Hawkwind visual biography, and I've got 80 copies, may not be getting more, but it's just like the other ones. It's like the Heap and the Nazareth, a very detailed timeline for this very complicated band, and then lots and lots of pictures, a lot that haven't been seen before. I think about 350 pictures, and my web guy now has it up at the site. So at martinpopoff.com, this is available with PayPal buttons for international, US and Canada. Ready to roll. Big, huge, heavy hardcover. There you go.
I love that cover image. That is a great photograph.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice and obscure, like the band, right?
Yeah.
Quite often a lot of the photography is this silhouetting thing that they did. They did a lot of this, mysterious, mystique thing, possibly to hide the fact that no one had a clue what members were in the band at any time, right?
Well, back then the light show was just was a major part of the show, right? I mean, you're hearing the music. Most people, let's be real here. Most people who went to see Hawkwind back in the day were either stoned or tripping on acid, right? So that's what it's all about. So you're not really paying that much attention to what the guys in the band are doing, but you want that light show. You want all the shadows and the lights and all that kind of stuff. It's part of the experience. So that is like a perfect cover for that book, because there you got Dave Brock. You can't really see him. He's almost like he's in shadow with the lights blasting from behind him. So it's perfect. So if you could set aside a copy for me, I'll get you PayPal later today. So cool. So thanks for watching, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on YouTube all the damn time. Tune in next Friday for a look at Hipgnosis album covers for Martin Popoff. I am Pete Pardo. We'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.